Let's talk about a new document that helps shed light on one of the most momentous episodes in modern Mormonism. I've spent my entire academic career hunting documents, trying to find the next great archival treasure. Never, until last week, have I had a significant resource just emailed to my inbox. But that's exactly what happened. Last week, I received an email unprompted from one of my wonderful people who watch my various videos that really took me for a ride. Now, for starters, this is just a good sign of what a wonderful community this is becoming, and I'm so grateful for people who are willing to geek out over history with me and sometimes contribute to that history. Now, this isn't a groundbreaking document or even a smoking gun in the popular imagination. But I think it's still quite important, and it helps us understand a very significant historical moment. It adds another piece to the broader puzzle. I also thought it would be a good chance, a launching pad to discuss this important event, and also to engage how historians approach history and interpret sources like this one. And I also wanted to make sure to keep the human element of the story at the forefront. So we're going to get to the document in just a few minutes, I promise. As I said, it's not necessarily monumental, but it is quite important in confirming long-held assumptions and dispelling some traditional yet untrue ecclesiastical narratives regarding LDS church discipline. It has to do with the September 6th, a dark day for Mormon scholars and intellectuals, when 6 prominent figures suffered ecclesiastical punishment in 1993. So in this video, I hope to provide some background to the September 6th saga, including highlighting some of the important work on the topic, then introduce this new document and discuss its significance and where it fits into the broader story. Then I'm going to talk to 2 scholars in this field who have spent a lot of time on the topic, including the author of the definitive work on the September 6th, so that they can give their perspective on this source. And then finally, I'm going to talk with Maxine Hanks, one of the figures at the center of the September 6th story, because she was one of those excommunicated during the 1993 purge. That's a lot to get to, so let's get started. First, we need to talk about the September 6th to get that historical episode in its context in order to understand the legacies as well as the significance of this new primary source. I've done several videos in the past on Leonard Arrington, the historian's office, which make up one component of a decades-long clash between academics on the one side and the LDS institution on the other. A new generation of scholars in the 1970s produced works that challenged traditional narratives, and the end of the racial restriction in 1978, which depended, at least in part, on historical scholarship itself, challenging the traditional assertion that the racial restriction began with Joseph Smith, demonstrated the significance of historical scholarship and how it can challenge traditional truth claims. This was also at a time, the same time as, and drew from, broader culture wars over historical work in which debates over the past became a partisan issue with clear us versus them guidelines. D. Michael Quinn, who is one of the historians first in Leonard J. Arrington's historian's office and then later works at BYU, was quite indicative of this new age, and his work on the LDS hierarchy and especially on post-manifesto polygamy are some of the best examples. I did an entire video on D. Michael Quinn's historical scholarship that resulted in part in his excommunication in 1993 as part of the September 6th, but I also strongly recommend the memoir that he authored later in life, Chosen Path, a memoir published posthumously by Signature Books. More on that in a bit. But the historical realm was just one sphere that challenged the traditional church. Also in the 1970s and 80s, you had growing clashes over gender roles, and especially the place of women. Second wave feminism that was spreading across America at the time meant re-questioning central issues regarding the place of women. And a group of faithful women in Boston organized the Exponent 2 movement that highlighted the problems of gender equality in the faith. And another circle that was often more radical, based around Salt Lake City, also raised questions concerning the divine feminine, women's ordination, and other notions of female equality. The RLDS Church, now Communion of Christ, also ordained women to the priesthood in 1984, which meant there were questions circulating in the broader Mormon diaspora about how women can challenge entrenched traditional structures. And finally, there is also growing institutional concern over homosexuality. The movement for same-sex marriage was still somewhat nascent, but Dallin H. Oakes, added to the Quorum of the Twelve in 1984, identified homosexuality as the next major battle on the church's public front as early as 1984, just months after joining the Quorum of the Twelve. And we also know it was increasingly at the front of mind for church leaders, seeing homosexuality as a major threat that they're going to have to confront. So all of this laid a groundwork for a major clash by the early 1990s. Before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of nerdy content, make sure you are subscribed to my channel. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have chosen to give back, you can become a member of this channel where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get a little icon next to your name, and most importantly, you know you are allowing this channel to for both me and my producer Anthony to dedicate our resources and time to putting out this content. 3 videos a week, typically deep dives on topics on Mondays, connecting the past to the present on Wednesdays, and pulling back the curtain on historical scholarship on Fridays. I also recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter, a free newsletter where I give out bi-weekly emails with updates, links to my various activities across different platforms, and I recommend following me on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook because I do other videos on top of these substantial videos on YouTube. And also mark your calendars for Wednesday, February 18th at 2 p.m. Mountain Time. I'm going to be doing a live book launch Q&A with Eli McCann, the phenomenal and hilarious essay writer for the Salt Lake Tribune, who has a new book of his essays coming out with Signature Books. So pay attention to that. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, let's get back to the September 6th. The Mormon studies scholar Sarah Patterson, in her definitive book on the September 6th, titled The September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism, persuasively argues that due to these cultural currents of the 1970s and 1980s, by the 1990s, church leaders sought to maintain boundaries for doctrinal, familial, and bodily purity. And they saw these growing threats as chipping away at those important boundaries. The push for correlation during this era meant that these alternative voices, the term they used, challenged traditional stories. Simultaneously, there's also a growing right-wing extreme movement, these fringe figures that I'll highlight one of them in a bit, but I think I'm going to do a whole video on them at some point in the future, that really took up a lot of LDS leader mental space of how to deal with them. So we see across the early 1990s this push to try to rein in fringe voices. They took over the women's conference at Brigham Young University, previously held by scholars and addressing more edgy topics. They placed constraints on BYU faculty. They restricted church employee participation in venues like Dialogue, and they issued a statement on alternative voices that banned church employees from participating in venues like Sunstone. Many intellectuals were called in to meet with their ecclesiastical leaders, their bishops and stake presidents in 1984, though that attempted purge was squashed by Gordon B. Hinckley in the first presidency, and others were not able to avoid that discipline. D. Michael Quinn was forced to resign from Brigham Young University in 1987. But then there were some major tipping points in the early 1990s. Maxine Hanks, an independent Mormon theologian, feminist, and activist, published an edited collection, Women and Authority, Re-Emerging Mormon Feminism, with signature books that compiled a lot of this revisionist scholarship that directly challenged traditional LDS teachings. Other individuals like Lavina Fielding Anderson founded the organization Mormon Alliance, devoted to exposing cases of ecclesiastical church, again challenging that ecclesiastical authority. And then Lavina Fielding Anderson compiled a lot of that data into a Sunstone presentation in 1992, later published in Dialogue, titled The LDS Intellectual Community and Church Leadership, a Contemporary Chronology. That, among other things, exposed the existence of the strengthening of the members of the Church Committee, a committee devoted to try to find these nefarious teachings and publications of church members. So in early 1993, Boyd K. Packer, a member of the Quorum of the 12, spoke before the church's all-coordinating church council and said that the three biggest threats making inroads within the church were the gays, the feminists, and the so-called intellectuals. Those same three spheres that I highlighted were, developing new ideas during the 1970s and 80s and now coming to a crossroad in the 1990s. The year 1993 ended up being the crossroads, the watershed. Reports started spreading early on in the year through the spring and the summer and eventually the fall of more intellectuals being called in. And while 6 end up getting the mainstream attention, over 24 Mormon intellectuals were called into church leaders. But the 6 prominent cases were these individuals: D. Michael Quinn, the historian who first got in trouble for his post-manifesto polygamy. Then his queer lifestyle, of course, gathered attention. But according to eyewitness testimony, what really was at the literal top of the stack of materials that his stake president was considering at his hearing was his article about women holding the priesthood since 1843 that was published in Maxine Hanks's volume, Women and Authority. Then, of course, there's Maxine Hanks, editor of Women and Authority, author of feminist scholarship. Lavina Fielding Anderson, the founder of Mormon Alliance, also author of the Dialogue essay on ecclesiastical abuse. Paul Toscano, who wrote on Mormon feminist topics and also had a leading role in the Mormon Alliance. Avram Gileadi, the odd duck in the group because he represented the conservative wing that church leaders were definitely worried about, and he was excommunicated for his conservative esoteric writings concerning the millennium. And then Lynn Whiteside, who wrote about Heavenly Mother, who was disfellowshipped rather than excommunicated, one step short of excommunication. Importantly, the church insisted throughout these public disciplines, and public in that those who were disciplined went public with it, right? The church does not speak or give their side. But the one thing the church did say to the public was that these disciplinary measures were handled at the local level, that it was not something orchestrated from Salt Lake City. It was hard back then, and of course it's hard now, to fathom that coincidence, and all of this is happening at once across those different stakes and wards. And we don't have access to the diaries and private records of the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency at the time. We do have some secondhand evidence, as well as one regional authority who recorded in his memoir that he was explicitly assigned by church leadership to call a stake president who was willing to excommunicate far-right voices like Avram Gileadi, someone I'll talk about with Sarah Patterson in a bit. And now we have further evidence that there was more orchestration than the church admitted, an orchestration that has long been assumed. So now, thanks for your patience. Let's get to the document. With all that background, and again, thanks for your patience, I wanted to get the background in place so you understood what this document means and why it's significant. Last week, I received an email out of the blue from Lynette Sessions, formerly Lynette Clegg, who was raised in New Jersey and now lives in Cache Valley, Utah. Shout out to Lynette if you're watching. She had been going through her mission letters. She was on her mission in 1993, and he found a letter from her father, Alman Hiram Clegg, dated September 26, 1993. Now, Alman Hiram Clegg had been serving in the stake presidency as a counselor out in New Jersey, but he had just been released the week before authoring that letter from his position in the stake presidency by Elder M. Russell Ballard, a member of the Quorum of the 12 who visited the stake and reorganized its leadership. As she was reading through this old letter from her father, she immediately saw the significance, sent it to me, and I myself immediately saw the significance. Here's the letter, the relevant portion that I'll go ahead and read as you can look at the actual document. Mom probably gave you the blow-by-blow details of the conference, so I won't bore you with all of that. I did spend several minutes alone with Elder M. Russell Ballard of the 12, and talked with him about many interesting things. Right now, he explained to me, the brethren are worried immensely about so many of the intellectual people in the church, college professors, historians, etc., going astray. I think they are getting ready to excommunicate a large number of them for repeatedly ignoring advice given by bishops and stake presidents to follow the mainstream teachings and basic gospel doctrines of the Book of Mormon and other standard writings. In any event, keep a watch in the newspapers about such things. I doubt we will hear much about these things in the East. As I mentioned, as soon as I read the document, I saw the significance. I also saw some of the limits. So first, let's talk about some of the significance of that document, walking through the historian's process of what's important here. First, this is the closest that we might get to the words of a member of the Quorum of the 12, though still second-hand. I'm struck in this letter by the casualness with which M. Russell Ballard is sharing this information with the local authority, who is in no way involved with those disciplinary hearings, which seems to be showing that A, it's on his mind, and B, he feels comfortable talking about it with others. Notably, the letter does not say Ballard's words that we are going to go excommunicate them, but it seems heavily implied. Note, the brethren are worried immensely. What brethren are you talking about there? Obviously, it's coming from the Quorum of the 12, and that they should expect a large number of excommunications. It's also, in this letter, connecting, according to the account of what Ballard said, the alleged transgressions to both disregard leadership council, right? They weren't listening to their bishops and stake presidents, as well as doctrinal heresies, not following the quote, basic gospel doctrines. So it seems to be a clear line of Salt Lake City telling authorities to counsel the intellectuals then not following their counsel to follow proper doctrine, and so the brethren are now directing further action. Now, let's talk about the limits of this document. As I mentioned, it's not groundbreaking because we've already suspected, we have some evidence, which I'll talk about with various people in a bit, that there was some orchestration. It's also not necessarily in the hands of M. Russell Ballard because it's secondhand, but in the historian's world, this is a substantial piece of the puzzle. Historical works is made up of all these little bits and pieces of evidence that only make sense when put within the broader context. So in other words, I think this is a good chance to discuss the historian's craft, as well as an inroad to discuss the important episode itself. So at this point, let's bring in some other voices to get their take on both the source itself, as well as how it fits in the larger story. When I read the document, the very first person who came to mind is Dr. Sarah Patterson. She's one of the best scholars in Mormon studies writ large, having written several important books and articles on a variety of topics on Mormon history. She wrote the definitive history of this particular episode, the September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism, published a couple years ago by Signature Books in time for the 30th anniversary of the September 6th. She currently holds the Barron Professorship of Social Justice Education at Hanover College. I also thought about my good friend and award-winning historian, Barbara Jones Brown. Barbara is currently the director of Signature Books, formerly the executive director for the Mormon History Association, and co-author the magisterial and award-winning book, Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre and Its Aftermath. One of her first jobs after taking over the directorship of Signature Books was becoming the lead editor of D. Michael Quinn's memoir, Chosen Path, the memoir that I strongly recommend, which made her an expert on Quinn's tragic ordeal. So I was pleased when both of them agreed to join me to talk about this source and its broader context. Let's look at that discussion. I am now very pleased to be joined by two of the experts on this very topic. I've already talked about their wonderful books and their contributions. So now let's get their analysis on this broader topic and where this new document might fit in, especially with their own historian's craft of integrating these types of sources. So I'll start with Dr. Patterson. why did the leadership, based on your background and research, why do you think the LDS leadership came to see these intellectuals and scholars as posing such a problem that it necessitated intervention, culminating in these disciplinary measures?
I think that's a great question. My sense is that there was a vibrant LDS intellectual community, and the people who were a part of it were willing to and excited to bring all of the questions and methodologies of their disciplines to bear on their community. And they were willing to follow wherever that path led. I think that they believed that their faith, both an individual personal faith and their community of faith, could take those questions. And I think for church leaders who couldn't be well versed in all of those disciplines, those questions felt very scary. They felt like once they were out of the box, they couldn't be brought back. And so I think that they were concerned about the scholars for sure, but more concerned about the people who were reading what those scholars wrote, and who may not have been asking those questions themselves, and who from an institutional perspective might be led astray by those questions, whether that be that they lost their faith because of the questions, or maybe they would embrace alternate interpretations of things. And so I think the church leaders wanted to maintain the stability of the institution. And so felt like disciplining the scholars was the way to go.
Yeah, and the terms you use in your book is that they're trying to maintain doctrinal, familial, and bodily boundaries, purity, right? Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Yes. Yeah. And so I think that they were concerned about the intellectual questions, but they were also concerned about the kinds of questions that were coming from places like the feminist movement that they believed was an outsider influence to the church. And so they were also concerned about how those questions might change people's perspectives on families, and how families ought to work, and how they might change people's perspectives on gender and sexuality too.
Yeah. So Barbara, at the heart of this crisis, of course, was D. Michael Quinn, whose life and scholarship intersects in all of these different spheres. Given your time working on his memoir and his history, you have a unique perspective on how Quinn was convinced that the LDS Church was out to get him and the leadership was trying to find him. Did he have a justified reason to believe that?
Absolutely. It's really interesting. I thought of a passage that he records on January 4th, 1975, if I might read it. This is from his memoir, Chosen Path, where he's quoting his journal. And he wrote, this is when he's getting his PhD in history at Yale. He writes, I feel that my attitudes and approach toward church history are out of step with the assumptions and intentions of the general authorities. I think it will not take long before men like Mark E. Patterson, Boyd K. Packer, and Bruce R. McConkie, all of whom were top church authorities, will know my work and will regard me as dangerous or controversial. He's writing that in January of 1975. So he's known for decades that probably he's going to have a run-in with church authorities as he takes this new professionalized approach to telling church history, which is the first time this is starting to happen in the 1970s. And he records throughout his memoir and journal various run-ins that he has with church authorities.
And he almost goes on the run for a few years, right? After he resigns from BYU, he tries to avoid church headquarters, correct?
That's right. He takes a job working for the Huntington Library in San Marino, California, and is just trying to be on the run. He doesn't want church leaders to know where he is. Finally, he decides he wants to go back to Utah, and he does so early in 1993, which would prove to be a very momentous year. And as soon as his local stake president finds out his address where he's living in downtown Salt Lake City, he pays Quinn a visit.
Yeah. So, Dr. Patterson, when we get to that year, one of the big questions that historians have to confront is how involved is the church office building or the church administration building? Because the church insists, when they eventually excommunicate and disfellowship 6 scholars in September of 1993, that those are local church affairs, decisions made by bishops and stake presidents. But the participants, including D. Michael Quinn and others, emphasize that, no, this is coming from Salt Lake City. As a historian, how did you approach that topic? What sources did you find maybe useful in analyzing that question? And where did you eventually come down?
I will start by saying I approached it very carefully because I think it's important to note that we don't have access to the documents that would help us fully understand or more fully understand the role of the church authorities in the September 6th and other excommunications. But we do have documents that show us that there was, I'm sorry if I can start again. We do have documents that show that the church authorities did play a role. One that I talk about quite a bit in my book is the recollections of Malcolm Jepson, who at the time was the president of the Utah South. And he talks in his recollections about how he was selected for that position so that he could bring into line ultra-conservative right-wing members who church authorities saw as a problem for the church. And so he talks about how members of the 12 and the First Presidency basically instructed him to either get those people in line or to excommunicate them. And he also talks about how the same was true for Gileadi, who was one of the September 6th. So we know that in that example, there was a clear line of authority and that Jepson made choices about the stake president in Gileadi's ward, made choices about the stake president so that Gileadi could be excommunicated. Jepson had been displeased with how the previous stake president was handling it. And so we have information like that that gives us one piece of the puzzle. And if that was true for one of the 6, then it was likely true for others. We also have a number of accounts of people who went to meet with their stake presidents. An example would be David Wright, who in his journal talked about how the stake president had copies of his scholarship, and in handwriting that wasn't the stake president's were the questions that he was to be asked and various passages that were highlighted. So again, showing that there's some kind of orchestration happening, that it's not a spontaneous local event.
Yeah, thanks so much. And Barbara, moving on from 1993, these members of what comes to be known as September 6th have a variety of different experiences with the institution. Avram Gileadi, who Dr. Patterson just mentioned, eventually comes back to the church and tries to pretend like it never happened, right? Whereas Maxine Hanks, decades later, is rebaptized into the faith. And then you have Lavina Fielding Anderson, who decades later is appealing to be rebaptized and is never granted. What about D. Michael Quinn? What is his relationship to the institution of the LDS Church following his excommunication?
Yeah, so D. Michael Quinn is unique in that he is gay, and he is outwardly gay by the time he is excommunicated in September of 1993. And so while he continues to believe that Joseph Smith, the founder of the church, was a prophet and continues to believe those truth claims, he doesn't really have a desire to come back into the faith as a gay man, which, had very anti-LGBTQ policies, more so than today. And so he never desired to come back as a full member, though he did sometimes attend meetings and so forth, and always felt an affinity for the church, so much so that he called himself a DNA Mormon. In other words, saying, you can excommunicate me from the church, but being a Mormon is part of my DNA. You can never take that away from me.
Right. I really liked the remarks that Maxine Hanks made in the essay for the DNA Mormon volume that I edited for Signature Books, where he says when the LDS Church cited in a positive way Quinn's work on church finances and the hierarchy, that was almost a posthumous acceptance of Quinn, right? To kind of bring his scholarship around that maybe at least some kind of reconciliation that certainly did not happen in his lifetime.
Right. And I think actually before he died, he is aware that the church is starting to, cite his work as an expert. And so things are starting to kind of give a little bit by the time he passes away.
Yeah. All right. So now moving to the topic of this particular video, and I'd love to hear you two, as wonderful, recognized scholars, talk about this new document that has been provided from this missionary, learning from her father, who spoke with M. Russell Ballard in the midst of those excommunications, that seems to confirm what was suspected, that there was Salt Lake orchestration. What's your reaction to this type of document? How, as a historian, would you approach it as either confirming or challenging or extending your analysis of the episode? Does it just, reaffirm what we suspected, or do you think it adds depth and breadth to the larger story? Let's start with Dr. Patterson.
I think it's another piece of the puzzle. I think that it doesn't radically change the way that we understand things, but it confirms some of those things. I think content-wise, it's more of a confirmation. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading the letter was the tone of it. And that got me thinking about other questions. I think the letter is so matter of fact about what's happening. And so it's an example of a stake president who is not telling his daughter that anything's amiss. He's not noting that the church isn't following the procedures that it has set out for itself. He's not questioning that is what ought to happen. But is just kind of recounting it. And that was just really interesting to me, and just raised questions about how that might be the case for others, that even if they found out that it was true, that the church, that Salt Lake City had been orchestrating these, may have felt fine about that, might not have been concerned. And so that was kind of striking to me.
Yeah, that stood out to me too, that on the one end, Elder Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 just feels casual enough to just mention this to a man that he'd likely never met before. Now, of course, there's inherent trust with that person holding an ecclesiastical position, but this is this, directly countered the church's official message, but he feels, casual enough to share it, and that this stake president feels like or stake presidency member feels like he can just share it with his daughter on the mission, that like, oh, by the way, here's the news. By the way, we also learned about X on the atonement during the address. Whereas, us in this completely different sphere, we read this and like, oh my gosh, this has some major significance. That stood out to me as well. Barbara, what did you think?
Yeah, so I'm with Sarah. We've seen enough primary documentary evidence that shows that these kinds of things have sometimes come from the top. I don't think every time with every excommunication, of course, but so it wasn't surprising to see that this existed because of those primary documents from before. Again, D. Michael Quinn documents in his journals that when he is coming, he's running up against church leaders, and his stake presidents will call him in and they tell him who it was from church headquarters that is telling them that they have to take action against them. So we know that this was happening. What does this, so this confirms, it's one more piece of evidence that confirms this conclusion. What's new for me is I've never seen M. Russell Ballard, Apostle M. Russell Ballard, in any of these other documents talking about these excommunications. And the other thing that kind of struck me was the way the stake president interpreted it, at least, was that these people are teaching anti-doctrinal things, but they're not. Perhaps Gileadi, that may have been the case, but with these others, they're just sharing straightforward professional history, not anything that's against the doctrines of the church, just some parts of history that might be considered embarrassing for the church at that point.
Yeah, it reaffirms to me Dr. Patterson's notion of these doctrinal purity boundaries that these historians are now trampling on. Thank you so much. Yeah, right. Yeah. Thank you so much to both of you for giving me some of your time and providing the audience some an insight into your excellent work. And I recommend everyone to check out the September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism and Chosen Path, a memoir. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
Thanks again to Barbara and Sarah for sharing their expertise on this topic. They demonstrate the careful and measured analysis that is always behind good historical scholarship. But they weren't the only people that immediately came to mind when I was looking over this document and contemplating how to narrate the story of the September 6th. I wanted to keep the personal experiences of those involved at the forefront. So I immediately reached out to Maxine Hanks, the same Maxine who was part of those intellectuals that M. Russell Ballard told President Clegg were challenging the church and at risk of excommunication. She's not only long suspected church involvement in her disciplinary hearing, although, as you'll note, she is very careful in differentiating the church involved in calling a disciplinary hearing and the church leadership dictating the outcome of that hearing, an important distinction that I think we should keep in mind. But she also will help us place this story in broader context, her personal life and the church itself. So by background, Maxine Hanks is author and editor of several important works, including Women and Authority, Re-Emerging Mormon Feminism, one of the crucial texts at the heart of this saga. She has since been rebaptized into the LDS Church while still retaining her independent streak and capacious theological curiosity. She's also one of the kindest individuals you could ever have the privilege of knowing. So I'm very grateful to know her, learn from her, look up to her, and now interview her. So let's get to that discussion. I'm very pleased to now be joined by the one and only Maxine Hanks. So thanks so much for joining me, Maxine. I'll try to keep focused on a series of questions that I hope will ground this discussion of both this source in particular, but the moment in general in the human lived experience. So I imagine you must have felt the walls closing in around you during 1993. What signs did you have that LDS leadership might take action against you?
Well, yeah, the walls were closing in 1993, but it actually began earlier in 1991 and 92 because my stake president had a series of interviews with me asking me about my work, which was appearing in media. And so it was happening before and during the time I was actually creating the book. So before the book came out at the end of 92. But then in 1993, it got more intense by each month. So yeah, the signs were obvious. In addition to the stake president interviews, Mike and I were both summoned in February for interviews with the stake president right after my book came out. And Vern Anderson had done an article in the Associated Press about my book and about Mike's article in my book, Women and Authority, Re-Emerging Mormon Feminism. Mike's article was, Mormon women have had the priesthood since 1843. So Vern Anderson's article stirred up quite a bit of controversy. And so Mike and I were immediately called in for meetings with our stake president in February of 93. So that's when the intensive process began. And then in May, Mike and I were summoned to meet with the Area 70 in Salt Lake to talk about our work. And I went, but Mike didn't. And I'll say more about that in a minute. But that was another big sign that the walls were closing in. And then that same month, Elder Packer gave his 3 greatest dangers talk about scholars and feminists and LGBTs as dangers to the church. And the next day after Packer's talk, Mike was summoned by the stake president to a disciplinary council. So, and
notably, his stake president would have been at that meeting, given the position he held within the CES, right?
Right. They talked to the all-church coordinating council that Elder Packer gave. Right, exactly. He was there. Good point. Yeah. And so Mike was, he didn't attend his disciplinary council that he was summoned to the day after that talk, but he was in June put on probation. That's when they held the council. And then in July, they held another disciplinary council that he refused to attend, and he was disfellowshipped. And then, of course, in September, he was excommunicated. So he often described it as being cut off by degrees through 3 disciplinary councils that year. But then at the very end of August, 1st of September, my stake president told me that it was time to finally take action. He and I had been meeting and discussing my work for 2 years, 1991 and 92. But at the end of August 93, he said it was time to take action. So yeah, it was closing in all during that year.
So during that lead up and then during the disciplinary process itself, did you get a clear sense that there was some orchestration coming from Salt Lake City to your stake president? I mean, you'd been working with the stake president. You, I imagine, formed a relationship with him with all this back and forth over the years. But how much do you think is now being changed due to a directive?
You know, that's a really interesting question. And I would say yes and no. There were indications from leaders that they did have direction from higher up. And yet there were also indications that there wasn't direction. So in March, a professor called me from the Midwest and told me about a conversation he'd had with a 70 about Mike Quinn, because media had come out in the AP press and Peggy Fletcher's Tribune articles about Mike being summoned to disciplinary councils. So this professor had reached out to a 70 to lobby for Mike and protest what was happening. And the 70 told the professor that the senior apostles were very concerned about Mike's work and his motives. And that's a quote from what he was told. And one had expressed extreme concern and felt that it was time to finally do something about Mike Quinn's work, that they'd been very patient for years, but it was time to finally do something. So this professor who called me told me about this conversation that he'd had. And this was in March of 1993, as I recall, or April at the latest, but it was right around there. So that was an indication that there was direction coming from above. And then in May, when I met with the Area 70, he wanted to meet with me on behalf of the higher leaders. And he wanted to convince me to stop talking about feminism and feminist theology and women's priesthood, and wanted me to retract my work. And he told me that my work had caused the leaders some anxiety. He said that it gave them indigestion. That was his quote. So he was speaking for them to me to indicate that there were concerns about my work. And then so that was, a pretty good indication. Then in August, Aline Clyde called me. She was in the Relief Society General Presidency. And she said that Chieko and she were very concerned about me because they'd heard that some disciplinary action was going to be coming down. And they were very concerned and wanted to talk to me about how to hold on to my church membership. And that was interesting because they heard about it before I did. So they heard about it from higher ups. And then again, at the end of August, it was either end of August, 1st of September, my stake president, who I'd been meeting with for 2 years, interesting chats, answering all these questions, his attitude suddenly changed abruptly. And he said, it's time to have a disciplinary council. And that was strange. It kind of came out of nowhere, and it indicated that he'd gotten direction from above to hold a council. He didn't say that, But it was just this abrupt shift in his attitude. And he said he was going to call a disciplinary council all of a sudden out of the blue. So that strongly implied direction from above. And then one last thing I'll say is the conference talks in April, and then again in October after the excommunications. But in April, some of them were directly addressing Michael's work in my book, and these were apostles, particularly one in particular, addressing Mike's work. So these are all signs that there was involvement from above.
Then in the ensuing years, it seems like you also got further, at least confirmation or hints or bits and pieces of evidence that seem to confirm at least some apostolic intervention in calling a disciplinary council, correct?
Yeah, and again, that's such a good question. And hindsight is always better than, what you see when you're going through something. But I would have to distinguish in the word involvement, I would have to distinguish between direction to call us in for interviews and maybe to hold a disciplinary council to evaluate our status versus giving direction about the outcome of those disciplinary councils. Because the evidence indicates there was direction from higher up to call us for interviews and disciplinary councils, but that there wasn't direction about the outcome of those councils. And one thing I will say in the defense of the apostles and, in what they were doing is that historically it has been apostles who've been involved with concerns about doctrine, and local leaders are usually more concerned about people's behaviors and whether they're following the rules, And when it comes to major doctrinal issues or conflicts, that is something that apostles care about and are involved in. But I would distinguish between the direction to call us in versus to determine the outcome. And the proof of this is, for example, Lynn Whitesides of the September 6th, she was disfellowshipped. She wasn't excommunicated. She negotiated her outcome. And also, there were many people called in during that time, a couple of dozen really high-profile names that you would know in Mormon studies, all called in for interviews and potential discipline. All of them negotiated the outcome, and none of them were disciplined. So it was just us, And another thing I'll mention later on, in 2013, I ran into my stake president who had excommunicated me in the temple. When I returned to the temple.
After you had been rebaptized.
Oh, yes, I should explain. 20 years later, I came back to the church in 2012 and was rebaptized. Thanks. So in 2013, I returned to the temple. And my first time back to the temple, who do I run into but my stake president who had excommunicated me? I mean, you can't make this up. This is synchronicity, right? He was the lead main character in the temple endowment that day, the session I happened to go through. And he and I kept looking at each other like, you look familiar to me. And then we both realized, oh my gosh, you're the stake president who excommunicated me 20 years ago. So we kept smiling at each other. And by the time we got to the end of the endowment and went into the Celestial room, we hugged and talked, and he invited me to come see him. And when I went to go see him, he directly addressed to me that story about that he and other leaders had been directed by the apostles or higher ups to excommunicate us. And he said, I know that people thought that I was directed from above, but he said that wasn't true. He said, I was asked to interview you and hold a council, but he said, I felt overwhelmed by it. And I went to them and said, tell me what to do. I don't know what to do. It was really weighing heavily on him. And he told me that the higher ups told him, we can't tell you what to do. That's your stewardship. You have to determine that yourself. And so as he and I chatted in 2013, 20 years later, about the whole thing, he cried. He sat and cried. He had suffered so much over excommunicating me and Mike. And he said, I would not have excommunicated you if you two had been willing to meet with me and come to the disciplinary council and work with me. But he said you weren't willing to work with me, and it left me no choice. So it was really interesting. We had a really beautiful, healing meeting, and I told him to let go of it all. I said, I was fine. I had an amazing journey. It opened doors and a path for me I never would have had. And I said, let go of it. It's fine. It was destined to happen. So that was interesting that he specifically addressed that in 2013. And then one last thing I'll say is that I noticed this with both Kate Kelly and John DeLynn in 2014. I made appeals to their leaders, to their stake presidents on their behalf, and wound up reaching them and was told that they were praying about it. They were going to decide. They were going to see what the Lord told them and not to worry. And it was interesting because I also asked a higher leader about Kate and John that year. And I was told that the higher leaders can't get involved because I made an appeal to a higher leader on behalf of Kate and John. And I was told we can't get involved. We have to leave it completely to the stake president.
Interesting. So thank you so much for that moving and important background, Maxine. Now let's talk about this new document that I shared with you that comes from a missionary letter written by a counselor or an outgoing counselor and a stake president who met with M. Russell Ballard the day you were excommunicated. What do you see in this letter? How does it confirm some things, maybe open up other questions, maybe leave other things unanswered? What's your reaction to the document?
It's a really interesting document. Of course, we already knew that, but it confirms that higher leaders were involved in the summons, and it also predicted what was going to be the outcome, which raises that question about, did they know about the outcome? Was that part of it? So I was surprised that a higher up leader, an apostle, would share with local leaders who were not involved in that process about a disciplinary council, which should be a very private process. So that surprised me. And yet we did hear at the time in 1993, we did hear other rumors of leaders sharing with some higher up leaders sharing with local leaders that this was happening. But again, I guess they just wanted to warn local leaders. But it's an interesting document because it does indicate knowledge higher up that this was happening, and it does predict that more was going to come. And he tells Clegg, watch for the media, watch for this to come. And that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
I was just going to say that it kind of, what strikes me is the casualness with which he's talking about it with others. Even if involvement or not, those are confidential matters, and those disciplinary hearings should, be kept at the local level. But beyond that,
yeah,
like you said, it doesn't directly imply that we are ordering them to excommunicate these leaders. But if they're expecting a few dozen people to be called into disciplinary hearings, chances are there's going to be some excommunications, which might be one way to read that line.
Yeah, exactly. And he's expecting that there will be media coverage, so he's expecting it'll be controversial, which is interesting. And the other interesting thing is that the timing when Ballard met with Clegg, according to the letter Clegg wrote to his daughter, that was the same day Paul and I were excommunicated. It was the 19th of September. So it was already in process. It was midstream. And then the day that Clegg wrote the letter to his daughter was the same day that Mike was excommunicated. So the timing is really interesting.
Yeah. So I want to ground this again in the human, especially wrapping this up. And especially since you have been such a moving witness to this whole history, who has not been, afraid to share your important experience. Looking back 33 years later, how do you now reckon with those events of 1993? And I know that's a big question, but I think viewers would love to hear at least an abbreviated version.
Yeah, it is a big topic, because I evolved a lot in that 20 years. Mainly, I did major reframing of the whole experience. First off, I reframed it as an opportunity for personal healing and to pursue my own spiritual path alone with God. And so that's what I did, in the late 90s and all the way to when I came back to the church. I embarked on a path of ministry studies and interfaith work and clergy formation and liturgical studies. And I evolved and got really involved in interfaith work. And the events of 1993 became a complete non-issue for me. I completely healed from that. And I shifted my view of the leaders because I worked with high-ranking church leaders on the 2002 Olympics. I served on the Interfaith Roundtable as a member of the ministry and clergy from a different faith, Gnostic Christian faith. And it was really healing. I found a great deal of healing with those leaders. And I realized then, when I worked on the Olympics with these LDS leaders, that my one big mistake in 1993 was that I had misjudged the leaders. I had seen them as my enemy. I hadn't seen them as human beings and as my brothers. I kind of dehumanized them as the enemy back then. So that really changed. And I forgave the apostles for misjudging me. And I forgave myself for hitting them with a whole book of cutting edge feminist theology without warning, without any preparation, because I realized I hadn't realized that they were an audience of my book. I thought the audience was women and, feminists, and I hadn't realized that they were one of my audiences. So I had been oblivious to their perspective. So it really changed. I saw them differently as human beings. And I never regretted the book. I think the work on the book by all of us was really inspired and very needed to recover women's history and women's theology. But I just regretted that I had misjudged the leaders and not worked with them better during that time. I also realized too that the September 6th event was kind of destined. We all felt called spiritually, every one of us, to kind of play the role of shadow workers. And I realized too later that we weren't the enemies and we weren't victims. I no longer saw myself or us as victims, but as shadow workers trying to deal with the unknown, feared history of the church. And then, of course, I returned to the church in 2012. So the other way I dealt with the events of 1993 was to try to heal them, come full circle in my own path of integration, but also in my attempt to retry this again. And this time work with the leaders in healing ways to recover women's history and theology and not see them as the enemy, but as my brothers. And that's been really, really beautiful. So healing. I'm so grateful I returned to the church, and I've had extraordinary experiences of working with leaders at all levels since I came back. One last thing I will say really quickly is that my return does not mean that the gap between leaders' perspectives and scholars' perspectives, or apologists and critics, that gap has been healed. It hasn't. It's still there. We still see scholars and feminists and LGBTs summoned for interviews and excommunicated. And there's a current new kind of disciplinary process going on that I'm very worried about, where members are turning against members online, and members are appealing to stake presidents outside of their wards and cities and states to try to get other members disciplined and excommunicated. So I'm seeing this return currently of a desire to purge people who have a different perspective. And my thought about that is, didn't we learn in 1993 not to do that to each other? Haven't we learned better? I'm really concerned about this, members against members and trying to push each other out of the church. I think that's a violation of lay ministry and proper church process. We are called to mourn with each other and sit with each other. So I'm very concerned. I think we're better than that. I think we learned in 1993, and I think we need to rise above those fears of each other having different perspectives. I think we need to do better.
Excellent. I couldn't say it any better. Thank you so much for joining me and sharing your wonderful story, your great reflections, and your perspective, both as a participant, a human being, as well as a scholar yourself in trying to understand this important piece in Mormon history. So thanks again for joining, Maxine. I hope you found that interview as insightful and moving long as I did. Maxine always, comes through in providing valued experience that prioritizes faith in her background, but also the institutional context, reflecting on both the harm that can be done, but also the healing that's available. I especially appreciated her distinction on church involvement in orchestrating the calling of these disciplinary councils and whether they actually dictated the outcome being another question. Her experiences has led her to believe that the church was involved in the former, the calling of the disciplinary councils, but not the latter, the outcomes, while there has been some evidence and testimonies to the contrary. So that remains one of the important questions left unanswered, even with this new documentation. I also want to add something that she frequently says in different forums, that her story is only her own, and it's not representative of the entirety of the September 6th, nor the several dozen of LDS intellectuals who found themselves in the church's crosshairs during the 1990s. And so she often emphasizes that every one of those individuals lived their own life, followed their own trajectory, and they should not be judged one against another. I want to close this video and on the topic of the personal experience, with my own experience with someone else involved. I've been very privileged to know several of the September 6th, Maxine and the late Michael Quinn being most prominent. But I also got to know someone on the other side, and that was Paul Hanks. Paul Hanks was the stake president that Maxine Hanks was talking about. I think they're related some way, though I'm not sure. He was the stake president who excommunicated both Maxine Hanks and D. Michael Quinn. After I served my LDS mission, my first semester back, I did a program that Brigham Young University used to have in Nauvoo. It was a semester at Nauvoo program where you got to study in what was called the Joseph Smith Academy. A wonderful, wonderful experience that I think very highly of. In fact, my interest in learning Mormon history was really rooted in that experience, even if my studies ended up leading me in a different way of studying the history than that academy likely implied. But while I was there, I was a part of the school's choir, and I was I forget the title of I was the mediary between the choir itself and the choir director. And the choir director was none other than Paul Hanks. And I got to know him really well. He never mentioned anything about this history. I just knew him as this wonderful, old, retired, kind soul, very, doctrinally orthodox, very devoted to the cause. I could see him fitting into this story. In 2009, so several years after my experience in Nauvoo, the LDS Church finished their brand new church history library in Salt Lake City, the grand, majestic building that you can go visit in Salt Lake City across from Temple Square now. And I went and visited it, and Paul Hanks' home was just up the road, just across from the Capitol, so I went up and visited him. And we were talking about the new library, and he said, yeah, I went down the other week, and I, plugged my name into the catalog to see if it had anything from his years of working for the church. He rose the ranks in the church education system. And he said the most frequent sources that came up had to do with the September 6th. And suddenly this sullen look came over his face. And I could see, as Maxine Hanks said in the interview, that that story weighed on him as well. Especially now that we know this pressure that's coming from him above, as well as his own feeling of protecting the church. And that really drove home the personal stakes of the story and the care that historians should take when addressing this issue. I hope this video helps you understand more about the September 6th saga. I hope it also provides some insight into the type of work that historians perform in capturing these stories and untangling the many different questions. I also hope that it can help us keep in mind the human element of these stories. Now, if you want to know more, I strongly recommend going to check out Sarah Patterson's book, The September 6th and the Struggle for the Soul of Mormonism. I also recommend Peter Lindholm's collection of interviews, Latter-day Descent at the Crossroads of Intellectual Inquiry and Ecclesiastical Authority, published by Coford. I have links to both of those in the video description. A few years ago, for the 30th anniversary of the September 6th, Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought had a roundtable of scholars on the topic that included included Jana Reese, Patrick Mason, Amanda Hendricks Komodo, Christine Hagland, and myself. I try to place the September 6th in the broader cultural context of the culture wars of religion and history. I have a link to that in the video description as well. If you found this video useful, please hit the like button and please share it with others. I think this is a story worth hearing, and this new document allows us to place another piece in that puzzle to see the broader story and hopefully also keep the human experience in mind. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and I think this story is a great example of that.